Have you guys seen like specific flows of ASICs? I know like you guys have posted pretty cool charts where it's like a map of the world showing like all the different places you guys have bought and sold ASICs from. Are there like currently or in the past, have you guys noticed flows of like, oh, machines are going from the US to Paraguay or from China to wherever? Like, have there been any trends recently or in the past that you think are worth mentioning?
Yeah, I think the biggest one, and this is not us specifically because we can't operate in this market because of sanctions, but the Russians are deploying hella hash rate right now. Like a lot of, when I was in Hong Kong for the World Digital Mining Summit, there were a bunch of Eastern Europeans and Russians there, and Bitmain and some of our and then some secondary sellers that we're pretty close with, were saying that right now Russia is like their biggest market by far.
Interesting.
Maybe not by far, but it's like the majority of some of the sales that they're doing. And there's probably a number of reasons for that I don't know if I'm like totally equipped to speak on, but what I've heard is that, a lot of people are trying to escape the ruble, like the war with Ukraine, has created a lot of question marks for like what's going to happen to the country in the future, or like, the sanctions put a lot of pressure too on Russian capital markets and all these other things. Now, sure, like they're opening up, trading avenues with like BRICS countries and like other countries in Asia and things like that. But it seems like a lot of Russians are trying to find ways to, earn a return at a time when like they're kind of shut out from like all of the capital markets that they would otherwise be able to tap into. Russia's flush with natural resources. I mean, they've got shitloads of oil and shitloads of natural gas. So it seems like a pretty understandable fit. And I think that, it's going to be those markets, places like Russia, places in South America that have cheaper energy, maybe some places in the Middle East. And that's what North American miners are going to be competing against when the halving comes. And so, I think that you'll probably continue to see you'll continue to see market share increase in those regions, I think, because I'm kind of the mind that maybe North America, from a hash rate perspective, has kind of peaked. But I'd love to be proven wrong.
You're talking about like as a percentage of total network hash rate?
Yeah. Like there's always going to be capital investment, and there's always going to be miners deploying rigs. There's always going to be someone who has cheap enough energy to deploy the rigs. But I think that in terms of what we've seen over the last, the China mining ban, and since then till now, we probably reached some sort of peak. I could be totally wrong. And part of me hopes that I'm wrong, part of me hopes that I'm not, because I do think that decentralization of hash rate is important. Like, I don't really care if hash rate is in Russia. I don't care if hash rate is in China, which there's not really much anymore, but there's still some. I don't care about politicizing where it is. And I think that there could be potential, not attack vectors, but like stuff like the OFAC compliant blocks, right? That we saw like Marathon trying to push for a while there. I mean, if the government really wanted to in the US and they went to miners and they said you can't process transactions from these sanctioned addresses, then that's a very real reality. So,
you're bringing up Russia is interesting. It's funny how like censorship is such like an interesting advertisement for Bitcoin. Like it really makes the value proposition of Bitcoin so much more clear. And I'm not surprised at all that people in Russia or, the government itself or private companies or whoever is like, wait, we can be cut off from the entire global financial system like that. We need another technology that still works over the internet, and we can, send value to other people and receive, physical goods or digital services or whatever. Just seems like over time, if censorship does become more of a problem for other countries or even in the US, like Bitcoin will probably be there as a pretty good solution.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you brought up the getting cut off from SWIFT and just totally cut off from like capital markets in all of the other Western nations, because I think that is probably a huge driver for that for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Let's talk a little bit more about energy markets, I guess. Like obviously energy is a critical component to mining Bitcoin. It's like the highest variable cost, I guess. Can you tell us a little bit about like energy markets in the US? Like, maybe talk a little bit about nuclear. I'll leave this open-ended, but how do you want to take it?
Yeah, I think that if you look at where most of the hash rate is concentrated in the US, it's no surprise that it's in those areas like, Texas, with, basically deregulated is not the right word, but, it's a totally open market for energy. Like, as long as you check the right boxes and get approved, energy companies come in here and they can buy and sell on an open market. And that, Bitcoin miners love that because it, that drives down the price. Historically, it's started to become a little bit iffy because they've overinvested in wind and solar. That's why you see price spikes in Texas in the summer, because the wind doesn't blow. And then what they expect to get 20%. Texas expects to get 20% of its grid's capacity from wind on a given day, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. Like that's a lot of energy to be betting on actually having the wind blowing in your favor at a given time, right? So, I mean, Pierre does great kind of like micro kind of research about this, or tweets. Like he'll talk about like, power prices are spiking up because the wind's not blowing, like, and wind is underperforming. And so, and in Texas, we've actually seen over the last few years, power prices have gone up significantly because their energy generation has been more and more contingent on intermittent and at times unreliable renewable sources. And that's what a lot of people don't understand, I think. And energy systems are super complex. I've just been amazed at how much I didn't understand at all about energy and specifically electricity generation until I started in the Bitcoin mining industry. But I think a lot of people think that like 1 megawatt is the same as another megawatt. Like they think that it's just like all kind of fungible. But no, there are resources and there are energy generation. There are electricity capacity factors that are much better than others, and certain assets are much more reliable. Yep. And when you see renewables not functioning properly or just not producing enough to meet demand, you see base loads ramp up like nat gas or coal or something like that. And kind of extending that out to the rest of the U.S. There's a reason there are no miners in California, because California has like some of the highest electricity prices in the U.S. I think it's third behind Hawaii and maybe Alaska. And part of that is because they've got a lot of wind and a lot of solar, and they've been decommissioning nuclear power plants because we're allergic for some reason in this country to nuclear for a lot of reasons that are pretty deep. They go back to, just people think of Chernobyl, they think of 3 Mile Island, they think of Fukushima, and they think it's this extremely dangerous thing. But then you go to the Southeast, and you go to a place like Georgia, and Georgia's just flush with nuclear. Tennessee's got a lot of nuclear too. It's got a lot of hydro. South Carolina's got a lot of nuclear. And there are more miners than I think a lot of people would think in these regions because the power prices are some of the most competitive in the U.S. Georgia has, I think, industrial wise, like from any given year, like 6 to 7 cents per kilowatt hour. You can't really get any better than that. Tennessee's the same way. South Carolina's pretty similar. And a lot of that is thanks to the fact that they didn't take the solar pill. They didn't take the wind pill, right? Like you look at the energy systems in those states and it's mostly nuclear and it's mostly nat gas. They might have some renewables, but it's a very small slice of the pie. And I think there's, without getting too political about it, it makes total sense to me. I mean, these are conservative areas. They're dollars and cents. They usually are not kind of captured by narratives. And, they invest in things that are just going to work and that they're going to be reliable. And yeah, you mentioned nuclear. I think that the best thing that we could do for our grid, for energy independence, and if you want to talk about the climate angle, the best thing you can do to reduce emissions is nuclear. I mean, pound for pound, it is the cleanest form of energy that we have devised as humans. And the only reason that it's not more popular, I think, is a few things. Like I said, those disasters, which is just total fake news because there's only one documented case of someone dying from nuclear radiation fallout in Fukushima. And like the only reason that Chernobyl was as bad as it was because they were using an outdated reactor at the time that it melted down, right? And so like, yeah, you're not going to be able to abstract away for all of you're not going to be able to totally save yourself from some of those accidents. But even with the accidents that we have had outside of Chernobyl, they haven't been that catastrophic. I mean, if you want to look at energy sources that are the worst in terms of actual exposure deaths and stuff like that, coal is terrible. Yeah. Coal is awful. And what happened in Germany? Germany shut down all of its nuclear power plants, and now the majority of its power capacity comes from coal. So it's this weird kind of tug of war with the environmentalists. It's like they think that they're doing this great thing, like we're going to hasten the transition to like solar and wind energy for all. And then what ends up happening? Something happened in Pennsylvania recently. It's actually just a big boondoggle for oil and gas and coal for the fossil fuel industries because they're the ones who benefit most because you need base load, and you're not going to get that from renewables. So
yeah, it's funny how like some people think that because you might be, or whoever might be, anti-wind or anti-solar, they also they think they just naturally hate the environment, when in reality it's like no one really hates the environment. Yeah, like you're probably like by getting the materials and the resources to build solar panels and wind turbines and like replace them and clean them and all this stuff, you might be damaging the environment more by doing that versus building a massive nuclear power plant or a small nuclear power plant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an important point because people don't actually know what goes into refining a solar panel. Like Steve Barber of Upstream Data calls them Kohler panels because, you have to have massive diesel powered equipment to extract the minerals. Then you have to have coal fired power plants to actually refine them into solar panels. And then you're putting them on diesel ships to ship them to the US. And it's like if it depends on how you're doing the carbon accounting, right? Like that's the thing. Like they always do these this is like the carbon footprint of this thing. And like when you look at carbon accounting for solar panels or wind turbines, they don't factor any of that stuff in. And it's like if you want to do more honest carbon accounting, and I've seen these numbers, it's actually worse to do that on a long-term basis versus like just putting up a nat gas power plant, right? Like if depending on how you're looking at it, right? You can play with the data any way you want, but I think it goes back to like people just don't understand how these systems work. They don't understand how complex they are and what goes into them. And yeah, and I think that's a good point too. It's like, oh, you don't like solar or wind? Like, you must hate the environment, bro. It's like, first of all, I like solar where it makes sense. Yeah. If it was cost effective, like I'd put solar on my house. Yeah. Like for microgrid stuff, it's cool. And it's just, you know, like it as long as you have a way to like actually store the energy, which I think battery technology eventually will get to a point where that's more viable. Like absolutely,